The stress task is the last part of the procedure section, and the next section is the measures, which starts on page 635 in the top of the left column. When I scrolled to this page, I realized they included a heading for each of the measured variables, which made me curious why they didn't do the same thing for the manipulated variable. But that might just be me. Anyway, these sections should include all of the details about the operational definitions for each of the variables identified in the headings. There's also another heading that didn't fit on the screen, and unless I made the text so small, it's impossible to read. This slide includes all of the information under the heading for affect. Hopefully in a size you can read it, or at least get a sense of what I'm looking at, so you can look at the same thing in the PDF file. In the article itself, this is all in the left-hand column on page 635. The first sentence says, state emotion was assessed with the affect valuation index. When the authors give the name of a measure, that's one clue that the variable was measured using a self-report measure. In this case, the authors go on to say 25 items were rated on a 1, very slightly or not at all, to 5, extremely or all of the time, scale, which helps us confirm it was a self-report measure because items is another way to say questions and rating is a way for participants to respond. This is a good time to look back at the list of things I'm looking for. I found the name of the measure, the number of items, and the response options, so I still need to look for information about whether there were scales. I noticed the phrase, we scored the AVI into 8 established categories. Since the scale is another way to talk about the scores created by a measure, I realized I'd found the section I was looking for. So I found all the details I was looking for, but there's another paragraph under the affect heading. I quickly realized they had a second measure of affect, using the stress task as a way to gather data as well, which is efficient. It's also unique because it represents a behavioral measure of affect. At first, it looked like they're going to tell me about another self-report measure. They give the title of a measure, like they would for a self-report. But in the second sentence of the paragraph, it starts talking about a speech task. And by the time I've skimmed the paragraph and read a couple of things more closely, I realized they used a software program called LIWC to analyze the videos of the speeches that participants gave as a part of the stress induction. That program looked at the text word by word and can identify categories in the data. It has a dictionary of 2,011 words, which really doesn't seem like that much, but it must be because it's reliable. So the researchers identified a couple of the categories within the coding that fit with the hypotheses about emotional responses to stress. I highlighted most of that in the paragraph, but some of that's just my train of thought in understanding the measure, which isn't all necessary for future reference. Okay, so I'm ready to add that information to my summary. But where does it go? The section was labeled affect, but my list of variables doesn't include affect. It does include affective states. Affective states. Okay, sounds like they could be talking about the same thing. Then, after I reread the paragraph, I realized the affect evaluation index was indeed a measure of affective states. Rereading that paragraph again, it's almost like they're saying it's an oversimplification to classify emotion into just 2 categories, positive affect and negative affect. So we're going to use 8 categories in the AVI. Given that though, I think it's kind of funny they just used 2 categories in the hypotheses. Anyway, this is how all of that ends up looking in my summary. You might remember, though, that there was a second measure in the affect section, the one that used the videotapes of the speeches. But there's not another variable that seems to fit with that. The name doesn't help much either. Linguistic inquiry and word count is really a description of how it measures, not what. So I went back to skim that paragraph, and I remember part of a sentence about the hypothesis. More specifically, it was talking about how the categories they focused on were most relevant to the hypothesis that posture would affect emotional responses to the stressor. All right, that phrase identifies 2 of the variables in the hypothesis, posture and emotional response. I know this isn't measuring posture, and it makes sense that it measures emotional responses. This is how I made note of that information in my notes. Notice that I started by changing the label for the variable from stress response to emotional response to stress. So what do we have left? It looks like self-esteem, fear, cardiovascular responses, and task persistence. With any luck, those are going to match up with the other headings in the article, and I don't have to do quite as much decoding for the other variables. The information about the measures of the other variables doesn't take as much decoding as the affect measures, so I won't walk through every part of the thought process for all of the variables. When you compare the PDF of the summary to the information in the article, I think you'll be able to walk through most of it yourself. You'll want to look at the fourth page of the PDF file, which is numbered page 635 at the top. One thing you might notice is the paragraph about the perceived threat measure mentions scales, but I didn't include any scales in my notes for this section. To be honest, I couldn't follow how the scales worked given the way it was described. I think that was the point I started wondering if English was not the native language in Auckland. It is, and the information about the hypothesized situations and what participants were asked about helped me understand what they meant by perceived threat. If one of the subscales ends up being important for the findings, I'll figure the scales out later. Now that you've heard about the process of finding the operational definitions for all of the variables, you're ready to move on to the research design. That'll be in the next recording.